Adolf Hitler remains the universal archetype for a dictator. Yet, when historians look at how he actually functioned, he subverts almost every standard expectation. He refused exile, named no successor, and built no dynasty. While every other name on that list clawed towards survival, Hitler actively engineered the opposite outcome, ending his life in a basement at 56. This single inversion, the rejection of survival, is the starting point for understanding how the Third Reich actually functioned. The common intuition is that he seized power through a violent insurrection. But in reality, Hitler was invited in. On January 30th, 1933, President Paul von Hindenburg appointed him chancellor. Conservative elites had brokered a backroom deal, convinced they could keep Hitler on a leash and use his popularity for their own ends. This chart shows the legislative collapse that followed. The German parliament voluntarily signed away its own authority, passing the Enabling Act by a vote of 441 to 94. The entire transition to dictatorial authority took just 53 days. No other leader in the 20th century was simply handed absolute power by the very institutions designed to contain him. The government did not fall to an invader, it dissolved itself. The mechanism of the takeover was entirely constitutional. A typical dictator secures their position by eliminating their allies. For example, Joseph Stalin, fearing his own generals more than his enemies, executed 750,000 people during the Great Terror, wiping out nearly every original Bolshevik who had served with Lenin. Hitler's inner circle, by contrast, remained almost entirely static. The men standing at his side in 1933 were, with few exceptions, the same men still with him in 1945. Hermann Göring since 1922, Joseph Goebbels in 1926, Heinrich Himmler in 1923. For over a decade, the names and faces at the top of the regime never changed. There were outliers, a one-off strike against a rival paramilitary faction in 1934, and the flight of Rudolf Hess to Scotland in 1941. But Hess's departure was a solo, unauthorized exit, rather than a systemic purging of the ranks. Stalin gutted his military because his subordinates held independent influence. Hitler, however, concentrated authority so narrowly that his inner circle possessed no independent power base to leverage. Because they were incapable of challenging him, he never needed to see them as a threat. They were incidental to his personal control. This centralization of power reached its peak during the war. By late 1941, Hitler sacked his field marshal and assumed personal, direct command of the entire army. This level of micromanagement was unique among the great powers. Franklin D. Roosevelt deferred to professionals like George Marshall to handle the complexities of a global conflict. Even Stalin eventually learned to delegate critical strategic decisions to experienced generals like Georgy Zhukov. Hitler trusted only himself. He dictated the movement of individual divisions and personally managed the map pins in his headquarters, overriding the military professionals who actually understood continental warfare. He removed the buffer of professional military expertise, tying the survival of the German state exclusively to his own instincts. The legal rise, the static inner circle, and the total military micromanagement all reveal a regime that functioned as a direct projection of a single will rather than a structured government. This system lacked any mechanism for succession or long-term stability. It was a machine engineered to disintegrate the moment its center failed. As the war progressed, his generals watched in horror as he made decisions that should have been impossible. Successful autocracies typically share a single overriding instinct: regime self-preservation. The Kim dynasty has maintained power for 3 generations by engineering an entire nation to prioritize the family's longevity above every other consideration. Families like the Assads in Syria, the Duvaliers in Haiti, and the Castros in Cuba all operated according to this same requirement for longevity. A rational dictatorship optimizes for life and power, making every decision a calculation for continued existence. Adolf Hitler represents the massive anomaly, a dictator who completely ignored the rule of self-preservation. Historical and military consensus shows that Hitler repeatedly overrode his professional staff, making choices that actively sabotaged his own national interests and armed forces. To understand the fall of the Third Reich, we must recognize it as a state driven by an ideology that guaranteed its own destruction. By late 1942, the German Sixth Army was completely encircled by Soviet forces, closing in from two directions. Every senior officer understood the strategy for survival: break out immediately, save the men, and preserve the army for the next fight. Hitler refused. He ordered General Friedrich Paulus to hold an impossible, doomed position, relying on an airlift that could never deliver enough supplies. In February 1943, 91,000 starving and frostbitten men surrendered to the Red Army. Fewer than 6,000 of them ever returned home. A leader who intentionally sacrifices his best army while ignoring professional military strategy is operating against his own survival. Leading historians who have spent their careers studying the Third Reich converge on a single conclusion regarding these irrational decisions. The Nazi state apparatus was not built to keep Hitler alive or to maintain the party's grip on political power. The regime was engineered entirely around an apocalyptic racial mission, and every military and political decision was subordinate to that singular goal. By 1944, the German military was collapsing on two fronts, desperately short on fuel, ammunition, and basic logistics. The military faced a total crisis of rail freight, which was needed to move reinforcements and supplies to the dying soldiers at the front. Rather than supplying his military, Hitler diverted those essential railcars to Auschwitz. They were packed with Hungarian Jews and sent west. Resources that could have carried reinforcements east were instead used to fuel the gas chambers. A regime optimized for survival does not behave this way. The war served merely as a means to facilitate the killing, proving that genocide was the primary mission all along. We see the final expression of this suicide pact in the bunker during the final days of April 1945. Hitler left behind no heirs, groomed no ruling family, and established no plan for a future after his death. He only named successors like Karl Donitz hours before his suicide, treating the continuation of the state as a grudging afterthought. A dictator who refuses to plan for a successor has decided his state should die with him. Even Joseph Stalin, who killed anyone who might credibly succeed him, left behind a system that outlasted him by 38 years. Hitler's state dissolved into unconditional surrender just 8 days after his death. History gives us a pretty clear pattern for what happens when a dictatorship collapses. The tyrant, almost without fail, makes a run for it. Mussolini fled towards the Swiss border before partisans caught up with him, leaving him hanging upside down from a Milan petrol station roof. In 1989, as massive crowds stormed his palace in Bucharest, Nicolae Ceausescu escaped by taking off from the roof in a helicopter. Saddam Hussein was dragged out of a spider hole in the ground, and autocrats like Baby Doc Duvalier slipped quietly into foreign exile to live out their days on someone else's beach. Adolf Hitler refused to follow that script. When the Allies closed in on Berlin in April 1945, he stayed exactly where he was. For decades, popular history explained this choice by pointing to his public persona. People pictured a disciplined ascetic, the vegetarian, teetotaling monk king who denied himself every earthly pleasure because he was completely devoted to the nation. That image was a carefully engineered lie. It was a brand constructed by his propaganda minister, Joseph Goebbels, to project total commitment. To understand why he chose a bunker over a beach, we have to look past the propaganda to the hidden financial empire he was quietly building, and the dark ideological logic that eventually consumed it. In private, the supposed ascetic ate liver dumplings, drank diluted wine, and maintained a sprawling, luxurious mountain estate called the Berghof. He also kept his long-term partner, Eva Braun, hidden away there, ensuring the German public never saw the reality of his domestic life. And the public certainly never saw his bank account. By late April 1945, he was likely the single wealthiest individual in Europe. This bar chart breaks down his hidden wealth. Look at this first pillar. The state forced every newly married German couple to receive a copy of Mein Kampf. Millions in royalties bypassed the government and went straight to him. Then we add the royalties from his own face. From 1934 onward, every time a citizen bought a postage stamp bearing his image, he collected a personal payout. Stack on top of that an annual slush fund paid directly by the country's top industrial firms, plus a secret account held with the forerunner of the Dutch Postbank. By the time he died, his estimated net worth sat somewhere between 1.35 and 43.5 billion euros in modern money. If he was sitting on the largest personal fortune on the continent, why didn't he take the money and run for a beach like every other corrupt autocrat? Every part of his brand was a performance, except for the ideology. That was the one commitment that proved fatal. On March 19, 1945, Albert Speer's 40th birthday, Hitler issued what is now known as the Nero Decree. The order was apocalyptic in scale. He commanded the absolute destruction of every remaining piece of German infrastructure: bridges, factories, power stations, railways, and food stores. Nothing was to be left intact for the advancing Allies. His justification was completely devoid of self-preservation. He told Speer directly that since the war was lost, the German people had proven to be the weaker nation. For failing him, they deserved to perish. He condemned the physical infrastructure, and his administration matched that destruction with a massive wave of elite suicides. Look at this data showing the scale of elite self-destruction in 1945. 8 out of 41 regional Gauleiters took their own lives, along with 53 Wehrmacht generals, 14 Luftwaffe generals, and 11 Kriegsmarine admirals. In Berlin alone, there were over 7,000 reported suicides that year. Hitler's final act with the cyanide and the Walter PPK on April 30th stood as the apex of this wave, the ultimate expression of a government built to die with its leader. He was handed political power rather than seizing it by force. He trusted the same tight inner circle for 12 years, secretly hoarded billions, burned his own nation to the ground, and died in a basement surrounded by poisoned staff. Dictatorships generally fall into two categories. They are either optimized for survival or they are optimized for a mission. The typical tyrant is motivated by intense selfishness. They want to empty the treasury and live comfortably. That selfishness is exactly what motivates them to flee, leaving their country's infrastructure mostly standing after they go. Hitler's regime was built exclusively for a mission. It was designed to die with him. And because of that ideological design, it dragged between 60 and 85 million people down with it.